Why study chemistry in anatomy and physiology? Well, we get questions in medicine all the time concerning chemistry, like why is too much cholesterol bad for you, or is it? Um, what causes carbon monoxide poisoning? Um, why does iron deficiency cause anemia? What about iodine? What about isotopes? What's the issue with radiation, for example? Um, what are free radicals and antioxidants? So these are words and terminology that come up all the time, and they can be quite misconstrued unless you have a foundation in chemistry. So I've divided the chemistry chapter into a couple of sections. So the first one is atoms, ions, and molecules. There's some things in there in my lecture you could look at. I'm not going to talk about them today, though. I'd like to talk about chemical elements, atomic structure, isotopes, ions, electrolytes, and free radicals, molecules, and chemical bonds. So that's the outline of today's lecture. And again, the lecture will be online. So matter, elements, and compounds. What are they? What are the definitions? Matter is anything that consists of space and has mass. That's what we consider matter. So air is matter, rocks are matter. An element is a substance that can't be broken down by chemical means. By chemical reactions. And it's useful to write while you're taking notes because writing activates different parts of the brain and does help you to remember. But if you want to take a screenshot, you could do that as well. A compound. A compound is a substance consisting of two or more different elements. Different elements in a fixed ratio. So I'm just going to show you back this diagram. This is an element, sodium, it's a metal. This is an element, chlorine, it's a gas. And the weird thing is, when you get sodium together with chlorine, what have you got? Salt. And did you have table salt that we have and use with our food? So table salt is a compound. It's a compound with equal numbers of sodium and chloride, of course. How do you get table salt? How do you think you get table salt? Where does it come from? Well, you can make it. You can burn the sodium in the presence of chlorine and get salt. You can get salt chemically. So when you combine, for example, an acid and a base, you get a salt and water. So this is an example. Here's a base, NaOH. Here's an acid, hydrochloric acid. And what you get when you combine them is water and sodium chloride. So that is a source. However, of course, the salt that we eat, the salt that's on our tables, comes from mines of ancient oceans that have dried. So that's where our salt comes from, for the most part. And of course, nowadays you're getting all kinds of odd salts, like Himalayan salt, for example. Okay, screenshot time. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The periodic table has elements arranged by atomic number, and the atomic number is the number of protons in the nucleus of an atom. Elements have letters or symbols: hydrogen, for example, carbon, chloride, magnesium, sodium, iron. They're not always the first letter or the first two letters of the element. Sometimes they are something different. Ferrous, for example, is Latin for iron. 24 of those elements have a biological role, and 6 of them contribute to 98.5% of the body weight. Other elements are known as trace elements. They're in very, very tiny amounts, but they're extremely important. Yeah, so here is a table of chemical elements. And if you look at the periodic table, you can see from left to right, the number of protons is increasing. If you go down the columns, you can't see it on this table, but what is similar is that the number of electrons in the outer shell are the same, but there are more shells for that particular atom. So I'm going to show you some videos, but I'm going to do that a little bit later. The major elements of the human body are oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. Have you ever heard of mnemonics? It's a way of remembering things by using a phrase. So this is a phrase you can remember. C-H-N-O-P. C-C-H-N-O-P. So crazy Kathy has no other plans. So you can use the first letter: carbon, calcium, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus. So that's one way to remember. And you should remember the major elements of the human body. Lesser elements, but that are extremely important, of course: sulfur, potassium, sodium, chlorine, magnesium, and iron. All of these elements you find in the macromolecules of the body. Some trace elements are chromium, cobalt, copper. In particular, iodine and iron are the two that we want to look at. Iron now is included in lesser elements, but it's also present in very, very small quantities, but of course very, very important. When you think of nutrients, we're often advised to not only eat our vitamins, but also our minerals. You do need minerals in the body. They're inorganic elements. We get them from plants. Some of them are electrolytes, so they're dissolved in our tissue and our blood and our interstitial tissue. So those are things like sodium, potassium, phosphorus, and chlorine. Other minerals such as copper and zinc are cofactors, and they are required by enzymes in the body for function. Some minerals like calcium, phosphorus, fluorine, they are in our bones and teeth, and that equals about 4% of your body weight. So when and if you are cremated, that is what will be left over. Lack of some of the essential trace elements can lead to issues. So a lack of iodine, for example, may lead to a goiter. And the reason for that is that the iodine contributes to the hormones of the thyroid, which controls metabolism of the body. And we're going to do an exercise about iodine when we go on to back channel chat. So the thyroid tries to compensate for the lack of iodine by growing large. And you can see it sometimes just by observation, a goiter which occurs in the neck. You can see it by X-ray when the trachea is deviated to the side by the goiter. You can see it by a CT scan with injected isotopes, and you can also see it with a CT scan. So I'd like to give you an idea of biological size scale. So what are the sizes of various substances that we're looking at in chemistry, and how can we observe them? So if we're using a light microscope, which we have in our lab, we can observe cells. We can observe plant cells, animal cells. We can observe bacteria with the higher magnifications, and we may be able to observe the very, 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 very largest virus, the pox virus. But for things that are smaller, we need another type of microscope called the electron microscope, which instead of using light, uses electrons. It shoots electrons at a specimen, and it gathers up on the specimen. So we can then see smaller things, smaller viruses, ribosomes, some proteins, for example. To see even smaller things, tiny molecules, we can use X-rays. These are specialty kinds of X-ray machines. And for even smaller ones, we may be able to see some small molecules and larger atoms. So when we talk about chemistry, we know a lot just simply from chemical experimentation in beakers and Erlenmeyer flasks, but also we can see a lot of these chemicals. So these are the types of tools that we use. This is the light microscope. This is an electron microscope, extremely expensive. We don't have one at Vancouver Community College, although we'd love to have one. An X-ray. So through the light microscope, for example, at a low magnification, you may be able to see a blood vessel. So this is a transverse section of a blood vessel with red blood cells on the inside. With the electron microscope, there's two kinds. There's a transmission electron microscope, for which you need very, very thin samples. But there's also a scanning electron microscope where you can get 3D images like this one. So this one is from a scanning electron microscope, or SEM. And these, of course, are X-rays of hard tissue. Atoms are structured in such a way that there is a nucleus and shells of electrons around the outside. The protons in the nucleus are positively charged. The neutrons in the nucleus have no charge. And the electrons have a negative charge. So the outermost shell is known as the valence shell. The outermost electrons are known as valence electrons. And those are the ones that interact with other atoms. The atomic mass of, sorry, that's not what I meant to say. Atomic mass is, the total number of protons and neutrons. Yeah. So an atom is mostly space, which is very odd to think of, but mostly the atom is empty space. There's the nucleus, and the atoms are very far away. So for example, if the nucleus were a golf ball, And the golf ball, we're sitting right here. The electrons, and I'm down on the west end by Stanley Park, the electrons would be in Burnaby. So it's odd to think of it that way, but we are mostly empty space. Yeah. If you remove the empty space from the atoms of all people, the entire human race could fit in the volume of a sugar cube. And that's odd to think of, but that's the nature of atoms. And so question was, where is the coronavirus on the size approximation? The coronavirus is very, very small. So you would definitely need nuclear magnetic resonance imaging in order to see a coronavirus. We use planetary models of elements like this because since the electrons could be like a kilometer away, we can't draw them to scale. So we use a model like this. Although the electrons aren't in a perfect sphere either, as you may know from other chemistry classes, they spin around the nucleus in various shapes. And there are, in quantum mechanics or quantum physics, there are ways of figuring out where an electron will be at any given time. But we're not delving into chemistry that much. Our interest is more about chemical reactions and how it affects tissue of the human body. But this is an example of different elements that have a different atomic number, which is the number of protons, and atomic mass, which is the number of protons and the number of neutrons. And of course, it varies with different elements. So what's interesting, especially in biology and medicine, is that elements don't always have the same number of neutrons. Indeed, sometimes they have a few more or a few less. So isotopes differ in the number of neutrons that they have. Interestingly, they're the same in chemical behavior, but they may differ in physical behavior. For example, they have different atomic weights because you have different number of neutrons. Pretty much all elements have them. So carbon, for example, carbon-12 is the really super common carbon isotope. It's in our atmosphere, it's in our bodies, it's everywhere. We are carbon-based life forms. But there are also a very few carbon-13, so with one extra neutrons, but carbon-13 is stable. However, there are also a very small amount of carbon-14 atoms in the environment, and they are unstable. So carbon-14 has too many neutrons. That is not a stable environment for that atom. So it's going to decay. It's going to shoot off something out of its nucleus so that it becomes stable. And a stable carbon-14 atom is a nitrogen-14 atom. Carbon-14 decays into nitrogen-14, which has 7 neutrons and 7 protons. But radioisotopes are extremely useful in biology. So the types of radiation that are given off by radioisotopes. So a radioisotope is unstable. It will decay over time. But the type of decay of a radioisotope varies. It's not always the same. So some of the particles of this decay, so the particles or energy emitted from an unstable isotope or a radioisotope is called radiation. And there are different types. There's alpha. Alpha particles have 2 protons and 2 neutrons. An alpha particle is the same as a helium nucleus, for example. But alpha particles do not penetrate the skin. Beta particles is another kind of decay, which are electrons ejected from the nucleus, and that can cause, sorry, that can, I'm just not going to put that down. That can penetrate skin by a small amount, a couple of millimeters. The other type of radiation that's sometimes emitted from radioisotopes is called gamma. And gamma radiation has no mass. It penetrates tissue and is very, very strong. So all radiation can cause ionization of molecules. That can be dangerous. But not all radioisotopes cause danger. Some radioisotopes are used to detect disorders, such as thyroid deficiencies. So they can be used for detection purposes. They can also be used as treatment. Gamma rays, for example, oh, that wasn't a very good symbol. Are used in cancer treatment. They're used in cancer treatment to disrupt DNA from continuously multiplying. So alpha, beta, or gamma converts atoms to ions. Some of the external sources of radiation are ultraviolet rays and X-rays. They are also ionizing. They may be mutagenic. That means they can cause mutations of DNA, and sometimes they can be carcinogenic, which means that the mutations can lead to cancer. What's interesting about radioisotopes is they have a half-life. So they will decay at a known rate. So for example, C14 decays into nitrogen 14. So I'm going to draw a graph here. So the y-axis is a number of atoms. Say we start with 100. And this is 1 half-life, 2 half-lives, 3 half-lives, 4 half-lives. And 1 half-life for carbon is 5,730 years. So in any given sample of carbon, like that contains carbon 14, 100 atoms of carbon 14 will decay into Oh no. Into 50 atoms, one half-life. In 2 half-lives, it will decay into 25 atoms. In 3 half-lives, into 12.5 atoms. So it is exponential decline. At the same time, nitrogen-14 will increase, like that. So that is the physical half-life of carbon-14. Biological half-life is basically the clearance rate of that radioisotope from the body. So it can include the physical half-life, but the major part of that equation is how long it takes for the body to excrete that particular isotope. So one historical person very important in the discovery of radiation is Marie Curie. And she was the first female in the world to receive a PhD. She was the first female to receive a Nobel Prize. She received 2, actually, the discovery of radioactivity in radium and the discovery of radioisotopes as therapy for cancer treatment. She herself died of radiation poisoning at 67 because it wasn't known then just how dangerous ionizing radiation could be. And I think, not quite the end, useful uses of radioisotopes are in things like bone scans, positron emission tomography, imaging, thyroid testing, rock and fossil dating, that's what C14 is used for. And isotopes have, if they're non-radiating, they have an extremely useful function, which is that most organisms, different species, for example, depending on even where those species exist, have a different isotopic signature. So depending on what kind of plants you eat, you might have a different carbon isotopic signature. In other words, the ratio of the different isotopes in the body. So it's a very useful thing. I worked in New Brunswick for a while on flying squirrels, and you can't observe them very well because they're nocturnal, but we would capture them in the morning and collect their feces, and then you could study the feces for radioisotope signatures and could tell what they'd been eating. So a fungus, for example, has a different radioisotope signature than grasses. So isotopes are very, very useful. So the last thing I'd like to talk about is electromagnetic spectrum. So radiation is along the electromagnetic spectrum. And so the main point is that the smaller the wavelength of the radiation, the more powerful it can be. So things like, for example, radio waves, they're not dangerous. They're enormous. So this shows you in meters, that's 1,000 meters, 100 meters, 10 meters. So very, very large wavelengths. So they just go around objects. But as you get smaller to microwaves, for example, microwaves are also not dangerous unless they're concentrated, of course, in say, a microwave oven. Infrared radiation, also not dangerous. Infrared radiation is what you and I give off as heat. So you can detect infrared radiation with certain machines. Now we're getting into much smaller wavelengths of radiation, ultraviolet rays that come from the sun. They're very small. And they're very small so they can penetrate skin and they can interfere with cells and with DNA. So that's why you wear sunscreen. That's why you wear sunscreen and a hat and not get too much radiation. Yeah, so the smaller you get, the more it can interfere with tissue and cells. And gamma rays, of course, are teeny, 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 tiny. And yeah, that's where I'd like to end the lecture today. Thank you for watching.